Hello, workers and friends. Welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist Leninist truck driver. Bienvenido en esta noche. Si tienes un pregunta en español, podemos responder en español. Gracias. So I'm here with my great co-host, brother David Fox, um, union organizer from Down Under. How you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Right on. So we have our third co-host from the UK, brother William Morrison. How's it going?
Hey comrades, how's it going? Yeah, I'm doing well. It's been a long day, and it's currently 12:15 here, which means it's currently my birthday right now. So I'm glad the first thing I do on my birthday is be at this live stream. So
Happy birthday!
Happy to be here. Thank you. Cheers.
Happy birthday! 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear William. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Yes. Fantastic.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. So we're very happy to be joined with a very respected guest. In my regard, a professional revolutionary, historian, and expert on a variety of issues, brother Flame of Liberation. Thank you for joining us. How you doing?
Thank you. Great to be with you. I might dispute a little bit how, a bit of the, praise there. I don't know if I deserve all of that praise, but I appreciate it. It's great to be with you guys, and I think this is the first time I'm on live with Comrade William.
Yeah,
it's good to be with you, and happy birthday to you. And I think we've been sort of, even though this is the first time on live with you, we've been corresponding a bit back and forth a lot through Facebook. So it's good to be on with you live.
Yeah, for sure, man. We've been friends on Facebook for a long, long time. So this is good to finally be on a live with you.
Yeah, definitely.
Right on. So I got to put a plug out there. Please share this out. Make this a bigger conversation. Get in the comments. Ask a direct question. So today we're continuing our study series on revolutionary demands, programs of demands. We started out with the 10 points of the Black Panthers. We've studied Emiliano Zapata. We've studied Marcus Garvey. We've studied the peasant revolution, the peasant revolts in Germany. And I might be forgetting a few. But it's interesting. This one kind of ties it together because we started out with the Panthers, and the Black Panthers had also a 10-point program, and they were very close with North Korea, with the DPRK, and that's what they modeled their 10-point program after, was this 10-point demands that helped transform Korea, and was really a beacon of hope for the entire global anti-imperialist movement. So we're going to do a little bit of background on the piece before we read it. Maybe if does either David or William have anything as far as background before we go to our expert?
Yeah, sure. I just say that when I read this piece of literature, it just kind of blew me away because it's dated May 5th, 1936. Like this was written like pre-World War II, and when we actually get into reading it, it's so progressive for its time. It's like it's decades ahead of its time when it comes to like the progress and stuff. Not going into too much detail, but things like gender equality and free education, stuff like that. Like they were talking about this in 1936. That's something that I find really, really fascinating about this piece. It's so radical for its time. It's just that kind of blew me away when I read it the first time. So yeah, just the kind of historical kind of context here under the Japanese occupation, and they were just being used for like their resources and stuff. Like really, really just a bleak time in history for the people of Korea. And yeah, there was this group of people in Korea, these communists, who were writing up all this theory and stuff, trying to change the world. And oh, it's so radical for its time. I love it. It's really, really fascinating. So that's all I'd say. Keeping it short,
All right,
simple.
Comrade Fox, any background on the piece?
Not too much for contribute for me. Just the fact is, though, when we've been studying a lot of these plans, and including this one, this was born out of the concrete conditions that were affecting the population of Korea at the time, and this was through dialogue with the mass of people there, and it actually gave them a vision to organise and fight for as well. And I think that's vitally important. Was when we're trying to advance things forward, is to give people a vision. Well, here's a plan. And here's a way forward. I think that's something, instead of just like opposing something or this is horrible, and that this is something concrete to get organised around and fight for. So that's what the fantastic bit is about. And it's not just came out of one person's mind either. They just didn't make it up. This was with dialogue with these other comrades, but also we do generally the mass of the people. What do you think? And it's like as Mal correctly said, from the masses to the masses. And I think that's it's brilliant how these documents come about.
Thank you, Comrade Fox. Brother Flame of Liberation, any way you could give us a little bit of background on the piece as well as the broader history of the revolution in Korea?
Absolutely. And I think the situation with North Korea, DPRK, it's interesting because some may try to shy away from North Korea as an example of socialism and anti-imperialism, because they may think it's not a perfect example, or it's kind of scary or something like that. But actually, no, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Korean Revolution is a perfect example to point to for socialism and anti-imperialism, because it's really so great, and it's so clear and one-sided in its progressiveness and its positivity. If you actually look into the facts of it, and so going into the bit of the history of it, I actually have a video on the Flame of Liberation YouTube channel called "The Start of the Juche Idea." I uploaded it a few years ago, I think 2018. It was actually recorded back in 2014, but I uploaded it in 2018, and that gives a lot of in-depth background on the start of the Korean Revolution. But basically, as you guys were mentioning, Korea was occupied by Japanese imperialism, and in the 1930s, Kim Il Sung led the Korean revolutionaries to overthrow the Japanese imperialists. And Japanese imperialism, it was so brutal. It was on par with the Nazis, Nazi Germany, and what they were doing. And so Kim Il Sung, he led the Korean People's Revolutionary Army to fight against the Japanese occupation in not only Korea itself, but also in Manchuria, because at the time, and still to a large extent, there's a very large Korean population in Manchuria. And during this time, during the Japanese occupation of Korea, a lot of Koreans fled from Korea to Manchuria to escape the Japanese authorities. And so he was leading the Korean revolutionaries, and he was an extremely effective leader, and he became renowned, very highly respected by the Korean people. And he was a communist, but even Koreans who weren't communists per se had a high regard for him because of his leadership in the national liberation struggle. And so at the time when Korea was actually liberated at the end of World War II, with the help of the Soviet Union um, and the Korean communists together. They liberated Korea from the Japanese in 1945. And, that's very important to talk about, because when we talk about like a lot of the mainstream history, they talk about how the U.S. and the Soviets just set up their quote unquote puppet regimes in North and South Korea. It's totally false because, and it takes away the context because the United States, even though the United States was fighting against Japan, it was not fighting in that region. You know, the U.S. was fighting in the Pacific and stuff, but not in Korea. It was the Soviets and the Korean communists that liberated Korea from the Japanese. And just according to the negotiations with the United States, because at that time they were being very conciliatory to the United States because they did not want to have a Cold War. They wanted to continue good relations with the U.S. Because the U.S. was an ally in World War II. They allowed the U.S. to move into the South as basically, as a conciliatory measure to try and be friendly with the U.S. But the U.S. Quickly showed its colors in establishing a puppet dictatorship in the South and purging the communist and patriotic forces in the South. And while in the North, Kim Il Sung, his government was established. He was elected as the leader of the North, and he was extremely popular all over the North and the South because of his record of fighting against the Japanese imperialism. And so the United States, for it to maintain its control of the southern half of Korea, they had to deal with that issue because the communists were the heroes of Korea. They were the ones fighting for the independence of the country, and a lot of people who weren't even necessarily communists looked at them as heroes and supported them. So there were the United States and its puppets in the South carried out massacres to try and get rid of the Korean patriots in the South. You can look into the Jeju Island massacre, all kinds of massacres throughout South Korea at this time before the Korean War eventually broke out. And the people that the U.S. installed in the South, you could go to even the Wikipedia article. Wikipedia is very biased, pro-imperialist, but even on there, you could go to the Korean War article and look at the generals from the southern side, and you can see their allegiance before South Korea, the establishment of the South Korean government. They were fighting for the Japanese in World War II. They were traitors to their people. They betrayed the Korean people. They worked with the colonizers who tried to erase the Korean people. And then they just continued that tradition of betraying the Korean people, this time as puppets of the United States. And the first dictator of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, he was technically not a Japanese puppet. Some of the other leaders were, but he was completely out of touch. He wasn't even in Korea. He wasn't fighting against the Japanese like Kim Il Sung was. And he was flown in by the United States on a military aircraft, sort of just a good metaphor for the relationship there. He's just a complete puppet of the U.S., totally out of touch with the Korean people. And he was eventually overthrown by the South Korean people, I think in 1959 or 1961, somewhere around there. So the South Korean people completely rejected the puppet government in the South. And it was completely clear that the North Korean government was the legitimate government of Korea. And that's why I say, some people are scared to talk about North Korea. But no, if you actually get into the fact, it's so clear, it's so blatant. The North represents the true aspirations of the Korean people. They are the ones who fought for the independence of Korea, while the South, the Southern puppet government, is consistently,
maybe I
led
could
by puppets.
I could interject for a moment. We started this study series with reading the 10-point program of the Black Panthers, and the Black Panthers have become almost mainstream in our society today. We recently had this Hollywood movie come out, and they're really respected, not only in the Black community but in the broader community. One of the people that we had on our study, if people want to go back, that we had a Black elder from Texas, who probably politically aligns more liberal, who was wanting to read a document about the Black Panthers because that's how much inspiration that she had, and then to learn that something so respected here openly supported and was allied with a communist government in North Korea. I think that says a lot, and it's a fact that we can really use to do outreach and mobilize the people. Comrade Flame of Liberation, go ahead.
Absolutely. And this is something that the imperialists, the corporate media, has really tried to obscure and erase. As you mentioned, the Black Panthers, highly respected and were comrades with Kim Il Sung and North Korea. It was and still is around the world largely very clear, the anti-imperialist forces, very clear that North Korea represents the true, people like to sort of sometimes refer to North Korea as true Korea and stuff, but it's absolutely true. The North Korean government truly represents the aspirations of the Korean people, while the Southern government just completely a puppet of U.S. imperialism with no credibility whatsoever. Sigmund Rhee, even though he wasn't a Japanese puppet, he was overthrown by the South Korean people in a popular uprising. But the other leaders, like Park Chung-hee, was a complete Japanese puppet, changed his name to a Japanese name, renounced his Korean identity, and then he tries to act like he's the true leader of Korea, and that South Korea is somehow the legitimate Korean government. Complete nonsense. And another fact is that, the DPRK exists today without any foreign troops occupying it. South Korea is completely occupied by the United States. They have no sovereignty. It's a complete puppet of the United States. And it's very clear, who's on the right side, who's on the wrong side, if you actually get into the facts. And as we'll get into this document, I mean, what the DPRK puts forward, not only on the aspect of who is truly represents the aspirations and the national liberation of the country and the sovereignty of the country, but also the social policies. If you look at how the social policies, the socialism that the DPRK implemented compared to the nightmare of society that exists in South Korea, it's a complete night and day comparison.
Right on. Thank you, brother, for that background. I guess we'll get into the document. I'm gonna attempt to pull it up on screen here. There we. It's not as good as it was, and then we're gonna read this aloud. Let me bring this up here as well. Just a quick plug again. Please share this out. Share this on Facebook. Share this on Twitter, and get in the comments as well. Let's see. Get back to Nick. Boom. All right, I got it pulled up. So I'm going to start, and we're going to do a round. Do you have the document in front of you? Are you able to read it with us, Comrade Nick? Flame of Liberation, still with us?
Yeah, sorry. You know what? I'm going to have to read it off of the screen. I could make it out as you have it here. Just turn the pages as we go through it, because I actually... I was mistaken, actually. I thought it was a different 10-point program because there's the 10-point program for the great reunification of the whole nation, reunification of the country, which is 1993. I thought that was actually, but this is a different 10-point program. But that's okay. I'll just read it off the screen right here.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll get into it. Let's see. I'll start, then we'll go to David, then William, then Flame of Liberation. Let's do it a point at a time. So we're reading the 10-point program of the Association for the Restoration of the Fatherland, May 5th, 1936. 1. To mobilize the entire Korean nation and realize a broad-based anti-Japanese united front in order to overthrow the piratical Japanese imperialist rule and establish a genuine people's government in Korea.
2. To defeat Japan and overthrow its puppet state, Manchukuo, by the Koreans resident in Manchuria through a close alliance between the Korean and Chinese peoples, and to effect full autonomy for the Korean people residing in Chinese territory.
3. To disarm the Japanese armed forces, gendarmes, and police and their agents, and organize a revolutionary army truly fighting the independence of Korea.
Yeah, I lost the document. What page was it on? 129?
Yeah, 129.
Okay. All right, I got it back up. So, Nick, if you want to go on to number 3.
On the screen, okay. Number 4, right? You just did number 3.
Yeah,
right?
number 4.
To confiscate all enterprise, railway, banks, shipping, farms, irrigation systems owned by Japan and Japanese, and all property and estates owned by pro-Japanese traders, so as to raise funds for the independence movement and use part of these funds for the relief of the poor.
5. To cancel all loans made to people by Japan and its agents, and abolish all taxes and monopoly systems, at the same time improving the living conditions of the masses and promoting the smooth development of national industries, agriculture, and commerce.
6. To win freedom of speech. The press, assembly, and association. Oppose terrorist rule and the fostering of feudal ideas by the Japanese imperialists, and release all political prisoners.
7. To abolish the caste system, which divides the rangbang aristocracy and the common people, and other inequalities, ensuring equality based on humanity, irrespective of sex, nationality, or religion, and improving the social position of women and respect for their persons.
8. To abolish slave labor and slave education and forced military service and military training of young people, while educating people in our national language and enforcing free compulsory education.
9. To enforce an 8-hour workday, improve working conditions, raise wages, formulate labor laws, enforce state insurance laws for workers, and extend state relief to the unemployed.
10. To form a close alliance with nations and states which treat the Koreans as equals, and to maintain comradely relations of friendship with states and nations which express goodwill and maintain neutrality towards our national liberation movement.
Thank you. So that's the document. We just read the 10-point program of the Association for the Restoration of the Fatherland. We're continuing our study on revolutionary demands. And we're going to do a round of initial impressions. And I think the key point that why we're doing this study, it really is a workshop against the ultra and dogmatist communist. A lot of the ultra and more dogmatist, mainly the ultras, they like to paint that, oh, they side with the Panthers, they side with North Korea. They like to quote Mao, political power comes out of the barrel of the gun. And they have this almost pornographic image of in their romantic image of a woman holding a gun, and it's cool and it's sexy, and it's like, oh, we're gonna fight it out, and that's a real revolution, and if you're not about doing that, then you're not a revolutionary, and you're a revisionist, and you're lame, and you're not cool like us. And if you actually read what the Panthers said, and you look what the Panthers said, and they basically quoted the Declaration of Independence. They spoke in the American political language, and they appeal to basic material demands to organize the people. And that is exactly what the big, bad, evil North Koreans did. They talked about labor. They talked about injustice. They talked about imperialism, imperialist exploitation by the Japanese. The 8-hour workday, going back to the American revolutionary tradition. This isn't this chaotic destruction fantasy of the ultras. This is mobilization of the people on a revolutionary program. Let's see, Comrade Fox. I know there was a good statement in there on labor as well. What is your initial response to the piece?
Right, let's just go back. Yes, it mentioned here, I think, point 8 to abolish slave labour and slave education and force military service and military training of young people. And obviously enforcing national language and compulsory free education at point 9, it flows onto there. And I think, look, at that time, for a place like Korea in the 1930s, that was a revolutionary demand. Interesting enough, it wasn't just a wages and conditions one. This was an improvement for the general population's life. And understand that living under Japanese imperialist rule was horrific. It was horrific, and these people were treated as slaves as such. They were trafficked, they were brutalised, and I can't describe it here at the moment. But the fact is, when they come out with something like this, I think it's good. And also, it was say it's good. Of course, it was good. What I'm expecting it to be. What I was explaining, it was actually what I said before at the introduction. It showed, well, this is something we can organise around. It gave some people a form of stability, something to look forward to. Yeah, this is what the vision we want. We don't want to live like this anymore.
Comrade William, what is your initial response to the piece?
Yeah, honestly, I loved it. Like I said before we read it, very radical for its time. And yeah, like Dust said, we just want to make it clear that just because we're defending and speaking about the DPRK in a good light doesn't make us like be a kind of ultra leftist kind of camp that like to just dogmatically just blindly follow and show loyalty to the DPRK. We're not with them here on this issue. We're studying it from a Marxist-Leninist perspective and kind of dialectical materialist perspective. So that has to be taken into account. We're not advocating. We're not like the typical people. Like they want to just. These kind of ultra leftists have like a quite obsession with like violence. They love violence, and they think they kind of use communism as kind of like their fashion statement or their outlet to be angry. That isn't really what we're about. We're studying this as a scientific kind of thing. But yeah, this was amazing. It's so radical for its time, and you can just tell it's a very short piece of writing. It's very short. It's only 10 points, but it just a fierce anti-imperialist message just shines through, and also just there's so much like fundamental communist or sociable principles that shine through too. Gender equality, free education, building national industries, kicking out foreign, alien kind of industries and enterprises and stuff, helping the poor, relief efforts for the poor. These are such like communist principles, and obviously, yeah, fighting against the Japanese Empire, fighting against the brutal occupation that the people of Korea had to endure for so long under the fascistic Japanese rule. They went through hell, and it's a really inspirational piece. I loved it. Yeah.
Thank you, Comrade William. Flame of Reverberation, what's your initial response to the piece?
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention that today is actually a historic day in the struggle for the liberation of Korea. If I remember correctly, today is actually the 85th anniversary of the Ponchobo operation, which was an operation led by the Korean People's Revolutionary Army and Kim Il-sung, where it was an extremely successful operation where they crushed the Japanese occupier military force. It was a major defeat for the Japanese. Of course, it was not the end of the struggle. It was one battle within, but it was it's considered one of the most important battles for the struggle, the liberation of Korea, and that anniversary is today. It's good to mention that. Yeah, this document, it's really great because it's, you read this is populism. And, a lot of the synthetic left, a lot of the people attacking patriotic socialists, Center for Political Innovation, and all of us, they try to denounce populism. They're anti-populist. And communism is populist. It's about, making raising the property question, all of these things, and making it relevant, making the communist principles relevant to the daily struggles of the people, of the working class. And that's what Kim Il Sung does here. Kim Il Sung, he didn't say, oh, the national liberation, that's not revolutionary because there's nationalists involved in that. Kim Il Sung didn't, say, oh, there's backwards nationalists who are trying to liberate Korea, so I don't want anything to do with that. That wasn't the position at all. The position was that we have to unite all the forces against the primary contradiction, which is the Japanese occupation. And he did that very effectively, so effectively that the communists were the leaders of the national liberation. There were more, what you could describe like bourgeois nationalist forces that were fighting for the national liberation, and Kim Il Sung worked with them from time to time. But he was the dominant force in the Korean national liberation struggle. Was the communists? Was Kim Il Sung? And that just shows how effective and how great of a communist Kim Il Sung was. And that's how you need to operate. And if you compare this to the synthetic left, it's like, black and white. No, it's so blatant. These synthetic leftists that we have to deal with today, anytime there's any kind of uprising by the people against the imperialist governments, the US government or Canadian government and such, they find some excuse to denounce it. They always find some excuse to denounce popular uprisings against the imperialist governments, saying it's fascist or something like that. The trucker convoy was a perfect example, where there was a uprising of workers and small business people who were standing up to the imperialist government. And these synthetic leftists found every excuse to side with the imperialist government against the workers and some middle class people as well involved in it. And I think it's, you read the points here, and these are points that are, these points connect with the Korean people. That this it wasn't some irrelevant discussion about, some far-flung, discussion about, oh, what's the flag going to look like after the revolution? Are we going to use this flag or that flag? And arguing, oh, this flag is reactionary, we can't use this flag, or oh, we can't use this language because it's reactionary or whatever. No, it's connecting with what the actual struggle of the Korean people is. And that's why Kim Il Sung was successful. That's why he succeeded in what he was doing. And that's what we need to do, in fact. We need to, as communists, as anti-imperialists, put forward a populist message that connects with the American people, with the British people, with the Australian people. And we need to make it so that we are the ones leading populist movements. That way we can eventually succeed in establishing socialism.
Thank you, comrade. Flame of Liberation. So we're about half an hour in. Maybe we'll cut it a little bit short. Maybe we'll go another 15, 20 minutes or so. Maybe if I could just kind of go down point by point and bring up some discussion here. Comrade Fox, go ahead.
Well, also, too, just for the viewers, it's an interesting thought. I was listening to George Galloway's Mother of All talk shows. I think it was around about May the 9th, and he actually pointed out that World War II did in fact start in 1939, as we commonly know it. It's actually started in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and that included Korea as well. It's interesting. I was watching a discussion with Caleb and Harple Bra when they do their weekly or twice monthly discussions. They're brilliant stuff. But Harple Bra mentioned, I think it was the Chinese foreign minister or visited them, and he said, well, China gave over 35 million lives fighting against Japanese imperialism and fascism. So God knows how many millions, tens of millions of Koreans fought against Japanese occupation and fascism as well. So we're in Western or English-speaking European countries have got a lot to thank them for that. They actually played a very decisive role against imperialism and fascism, and I think that's always a point we've got to take into mind. We tend to focus on Europe But we need to have a look what was going on in the Asia Pacific at the time and understand that was that actually start that anti-fascist United Front started in the early 1930s.
Mm-hmm. Right on, Comrade Fox. So maybe I can get a little bit behind the more theoretical, a little bit of the historical background. One of my favorite people, J. Theron Paul, the Oriental despot, which was actually on here recently with Brother Flame of Liberation. Folks can go back and check that out. I think it's interesting. He has this position that Lenin changed his definition of imperialism slightly between 1916, which was in the middle of World War I, and then later on in 1920s. For 1916 was more the fight was a fight amongst the imperialists, and the fight amongst the imperialists was the crisis that the Bolsheviks were able to understand from a scientific understanding, were able to rank for power from gathering forces from the peasantry and from the working class and take power. And then Lenin's later definition in 1920 was really an emphasis on the oppressor nations and the oppressed nations. And even that doesn't really fully describe it. It's really the monopoly capitalists oppressing the oppressor nation and the monopoly capitalist oppressing the oppressed nations. And that's really what kind of changed. So the next round of revolutions, starting in, going down to North Korea, the crisis was Japanese imperialism was making it unlivable for the people, and they were able to rally their forces and gather the people up based on the understanding of their country and of those forces and take power. And then we go further on in the Chinese Revolution into World War II, and how again the main contradiction, imperialism, Japanese imperialism specifically, the communists were able to fight against that. And I think this really leads the historical basis, even up to our current day, of the main contradiction still being the monopoly capitalists, imperialists. And if we can make populist demands and economic programs that go against the imperialist system, that go against neoliberalism. If you look at 21st century socialism, where these broad scale coalitions, if we look in Bolivia, in Mas, if we go to Venezuela, it really is a populist mobilization for basic economic rights that was fought for and then defended and then became revolution. I think a lot of people have a completely swayed Hollywood vision about what revolution is. And revolution is the people. Revolution, as the Panthers say, is power to the people, is organizing the people. It's not you're in a hut somewhere and you got a gun and you're fighting against the man. You know what I'm trying to say? And we need to get that out of people's heads and get the real vision of what a revolution is and spread that and understand that. Comrade Flame of Liberation, any kind of response to some of those ideas?
Yeah, I think, another thing that's worth mentioning is that when it came to the Korean Revolution, Kim Il-sung was a communist and led the Korean Revolution. But before that, when Kim Il-sung was very young, actually, and he was leading student organizing before the armed struggle, there were actually other established communists who were there, who were very dogmatic. And they were, and Kim Il-sung actually writes about this, how there were established communists prior who spent, instead of organizing the Korean people, instead of raising populist demands, they were more interested in fighting amongst each other about who was the true Comintern party and who was the pure communist movement, and they were totally ineffective. And Kim Il Sung saw that, and he learned from that, and learned how not to act and how to actually act as an effective Korean communist. And that's, I think, very, very applicable to today. You know, we see with these people attacking us, these synthetic leftists and ultra leftists, they want to argue about, well, can you say America? Can you use the American flag? Is that, they want to argue about all these things that are completely, and they want to put up all these barriers to make themselves unpopular with the population of the country they live in, rather than actually raising populist demands and engaging in populist struggles and actually pushing them in a better direction. They want to denounce these things as right wing and all this stuff, when they could, in fact, actually have the effect of getting involved and actually pulling these things in a left wing direction, pulling it in a communist direction, and actually putting communists on the political map as people who are fighting for the people. I think that's a good parallel to what Kim Il Sung was dealing with. And the point David Fox just made, I think that's really important. The mythology, there's a lot of mythology around World War II, of course. There's the downplaying of the Soviet role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. But then in the situation in Asia, it's also extremely, the narrative we get is extremely false. We're taught that it was the United States that defeated Japan, and it was the nuclear bombs that defeated Japan, and no one else had anything to do with it. Maybe Australia, maybe Britain had something to do with it, but the Asians had nothing to do with it. It was just the Western powers that defeated Japan. And that's completely false. And the Soviet Union played a major role in defeating Japan. Of course, before World War II proper started. I mean, technically, we could say it was raging through the 30s. As David Fox mentioned, 1931, we could really say is when it started because of Japanese invasion of northeastern China, Manchuria. But in the 1930s, Japan was having border conflicts with the Soviet Union and communist Mongolia. And the Soviets crushed the Japanese there and convinced the Japanese that any further moves against the Soviet Union or Japan would be disastrous, which forced Japan, because there's a question that a lot of historians ask, is that why didn't Japan invade the Soviet Union from the east along with the German invasion from the west? Well, the reason why they didn't do that was because they got their asses kicked by the Soviets and Mongolians throughout the 1930s, and they knew better than to do that. And besides that, the Japanese were fighting in China and Korea, and the Koreans and Chinese were fighting a major fight against Japan. And if you compare, of course, the United States played an important role. It's not to downplay the role of the United States in World War II in any way, but if you compare, the Pacific Islands that the United States was fighting in and the naval battles versus the fighting in continental Asia and China and Manchuria and Korea, if you look at the deaths of the Japanese soldiers and the deaths of the Chinese and Koreans and others, the real battle against Japan was going on in continental Asia, which the United States was not engaged in. It was the Chinese, it was the Koreans, it was the Soviets and the Mongolians and others who were really the ones who played the biggest role in defeating Japan, because again, these Pacific islands that the U.S. is fighting Japan over, that's not to say they weren't significant, but if you compare that to Manchuria as a massive piece of territory with huge amounts of resources, and the other parts of China and Korea as well, I mean, these places where the Chinese and Koreans and Soviets and Mongolians were fighting against Japan were way, way more significant to the Japanese Empire than these Pacific islands. And that's, that just like the war in Europe is, we're given a propaganda history of that, downplaying of the Soviet role. Well, the war against Japan in World War II, we get a very false history of that as well.
Thank you, Comrade Flame of Liberation. Anything to add, either Brother Fox or William?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting.
Brother Fox.
Yeah, and I mean, look, just continuing what I said, I mean, And the fact is, we know World War II was basically through the 1940s for us in Australia. I mean, the fact is, you look at this, and if people want to study military tactics and all that. Japan had most of its military forces, especially its landed forces, concentrated in China and towards Korea, and then obviously eventually towards the Soviet Union. They pretty much the Pacific was more of a naval battle. Yes, they did have landed troops, but without their forces being all so tied up with the fighting Chinese, and also too, let's not forget the Vietnamese as well, Laotians and others in Southeast Asia, Indonesians and Filipinos. They're all running guerrilla warfare, the whole lot, and fighting wars of resistance against fascism and imperialism themselves. And we should dedicate that to them. But because us in Australia here, we could have been on the verge of being overrun completely. If Japan decided not to if they could just move in on China very quickly, they were hoping to, they would have sent most of their military forces. We wouldn't have stood a chance. We would have been overrun, both Australia and New Zealand. And they would have had then the complete control of the Pacific, from the north to the southern Pacific oceans. And that's something we'd never thought about. People go, oh, yes, no, the US entered the war here. Yeah, there's some truth in that, obviously as well. But the fact is, at the end of the day, if military strategists at the time didn't get so tied up in Manchuria, China, Korea, and elsewhere, they would have actually thrown the whole. It would have been a direct assault down here, and no doubt eventually they would have not just bombed Hawaii, probably taken it over as well.
Thank you, comrade.
That's right. And if I could just add one thing real quick, even the hostility, the reason why Japan and the U.S. eventually went to war was actually over imperialist competition over China, because the United States had a lot of economic interest in China that Japan was sort of starting to take over. And that's what actually led to the conflict, Pearl Harbor and the eventual war between Japan and the U.S. So even the U.S. war with Japan was very much about China, actually, because there was the economic war that happened beforehand, and it was about economic competition over whether the U.S. or Japan would control China and these other places like the Pacific, like the Philippines as well, but especially over influence over China.
Thank you, comrade. I think it's interesting that we're taught to hate the people who fought against the Nazis now. We're supposedly the NATO Nazis in Ukraine that killed ethnic Russians are the people we're supposed to support, but we're supposed to hate the Russians. We're supposed to hate the Chinese. We're supposed to hate North Korea. And these were people that were fighting against fascism and fighting against imperialism. And the American people were against fascism. And then the British people were against fascism. Before William gets in his comment, I just wanted to hear from somebody from the UK. In the United States, I mean, other than the bombing of Hawaii, the war was overseas. It's my understanding in British history that London was under attack, that the UK itself was under attack. So it was the brave, Koreans and the brave Chinese, that and the Soviet Union that was fighting against the fascists on behalf of the British people. And maybe you can talk a little bit about I know you're a young comrade, any of the war experience and history from that as well as that understanding.
Yeah, definitely. No, honestly, I just want to say before I start off, I've enjoyed just kind of sitting back and listening. This is a new topic for me, and I'm glad Flame of Liberation is here to talk about it, because he's a wealth of knowledge on this topic. So I've learned a lot, so I appreciate being here. But yeah, no, I mean, Britain obviously has the fighting started off and ended up being overseas, but there was a time where we were under direct attack by the Nazi Germany and the Italians, the Battle of Britain. Mainly the fight for the air. It was mainly air fights and stuff, dog fights and stuff. Thousands and thousands of airplanes were shot down and stuff. And it was, thank God, for the escape of the 300,000 British troops who managed to make it back to British mainland from France. Thanks mainly to the civilian boats that were sent to save them. Without those 300,000 300,000 British troops managing to make it home to defend their homeland, the Nazis would have probably very easily overrun Britain. Without those 300,000 troops, we wouldn't have really stood that much of a chance. We would have put up a fight. We usually do, and we were like the last remaining kind of anti-fascist movement in Western Europe. Norway and Denmark had been invaded and occupied early on, and France, fell within a couple of months. So yeah, Britain. London was attacked. Major cities like Birmingham and Manchester were bombed. Children were sent to the countryside in orphanages in the countryside so they could escape the city, and their parents had to stay in the city and work as usual, pretend that everything was okay, and they were under constant fear of being shelled by the Nazi Luftwaffe and stuff like that. So yeah, everywhere in the world, there are people, there's common sense people that just know that fascism is just pure evil. And wherever you stand in the world, wherever your opinion is on, different countries, there are people in every country in the world that stand vehemently opposed to fascism, and we're willing to fight it wherever it stands, wherever it goes, wherever it spreads its wings. There are people at every corner of the planet that are willing to fight against it, and I think that's a good thing. And that's what I say about that. It's a really inspirational thing. And one last point I'd say, just relating back to the actual text, what we're talking about. Yeah, this is a great case study. This is a really good example of how imperialism is the main contradiction in the international kind of society. Because if it wasn't for the Korean people fighting for their independence first against the Japanese Empire, they wouldn't have managed to build and create the socialist system that it has turned into. They weren't going to be able to do that under Japanese occupation. So first you have to tackle imperialism, and then we can build socialism. You can't have it the other way around. It won't work. Every movement that's tried to implement a socialist society under the network of a kind of capitalist model or an imperialist model hasn't worked, and usually they kind of tend to end up being more social democrat, and they end up being reformist because pretty much they just give up. So the first step to creating socialism is to fight and defeat imperialism, and the Koreans did that very, very well, and it's a really inspirational text.
Thank you, Comrade. Let's see. We're getting near the end of our program. Maybe we can get into a round of concluding remarks. Comrade Fox, I saw you had your hand up earlier. Go ahead.
Well, let's also conclude. I don't actually forget our World War II vets as well that fought bravely against it. Both my grandfathers were in direct fighting with them. One of them was in the Air Force, the other one was in the Army, and the one that was in the Army was in Darwin when it was bombed. And it wasn't just bombed once; it was just bombed considerably day in, day out for a very long time. Also fought in New Guinea and Borneo as well. Very horrendous conditions, but also too, one of my grandmothers who served as a nurse World War II, she actually was transferred from one of the hospital ships just before it was torpedoed by Japanese submarines full of wounded soldiers and that. So I got to admit, we're all involved in one way or the other, so I'm getting a little emotional. So I'll give my respect to them World War II vets who do also too, who knew full well what they were fighting against. They might not have been card-carrying communists, but I will say this, I tell you what, they hated Nazis and they hated Japanese imperialists and fascists. Yeah.
Thank you, brother. So we're ending the end. I think I'll do a bit of concluding remarks, and we'll get our last word from Flame of Liberation afterwards, and do our chant and call it a night. So we just finished reading the 10-point program, which is basically the economic program that led to the creation of a socialist state in Korea. The catalyst being the fight against imperialism. And we went in and we talked about how, the fight against fascism, the fight against imperialism, and World War II, which affected, our own countries. including directly in the United Kingdom. And if we look today and we look at the main fight that's going on in the world, it really lines up with Lenin's 1920 definition of imperialism, is that the monopoly capitalists are oppressing both the so-called first world and the global south, or the oppressed nations. And you can fit these people in a room. Like, there's not that many of them. It's a few families and oil cartels that are destroying our lives. And what are they doing right now? What are they doing right now? They just gave $40 billion to NATO Nazis in Ukraine. I think the whole entire yearly budget of Russian military is like 60 or 70 billion. Almost on turns, and they're ready to arm these Nazis and fight to the last Ukrainian, and they're willing to throw Europe into economic turmoil. And we got gas prices over here, $5 a gallon. We got rents going up. We got a housing crisis, and we're really on the precipice of a new revolutionary moment. Life is becoming unbearable all over the world, and including in the imperialist countries itself, as imperialism falls. And it really is the heroic figures, the heroic forces, like the Russian military, that is on the front lines fighting against these Nazis, that our tax dollars are being stole to pay for. And we got to figure out how to get populism, get back to the roots of what a revolutionary is, get back to the Panthers, get back to the Korean Revolution, get back to real scientific socialism, which is populist. Mobilize this economic program, overthrow the imperialist, and finally we can join the world and join the rising economic bloc led by China and have a better socialist future. Comrade Flame of Liberation, maybe a few closing remarks.
Absolutely. And, this has been a great discussion. And I just wanted to add on a little bit to what you guys were saying, is that, they want us to, it's funny, they want us to hate now. They want us to hate the people that fought against the Nazis. They want us to hate the people that fought against the Japanese imperialists. They want us to hate the people who were allies of the U.S. in World War II. And they want to celebrate the people who were the Nazis, the Ukrainian collaborators, the Stepan Bandera supporters. They want us to support the South Korean government, which was made up of Japanese puppets. And the nature of all this has really been kept secret from the American people, because if you think of it, during the Korean War, if the American people knew that in the Korean War, the United States was allying with Japanese imperialists who were just killing Americans, torturing American prisoners of war and all that, that'd be scandalous. The American people would not support that. And it was so blatant, the opportunism of U.S. imperialism, utilizing these Japanese imperialists, the Korean collaborators. It was so blatant. They were utilizing not only Koreans who were killing other Koreans and Chinese and such, but they were even, there was one South Korean general that the U.S. Installed who was not only doing that, fighting against Koreans, but also fought against the U.S. in the Pacific. So the U.S. used a Korean puppet of the Japanese who was fighting against the U.S. in the Pacific to fight against the North Koreans and the Korean revolutionaries. That just shows how opportunistic and how blatant this is, how they utilize the Japanese imperialists to prop up this puppet government in the South. And it's just so blatant when you look at the facts. And just the concluding remark, I just want to add, it's not directly about this, but we sort of alluded to sort of the problems of the synthetic left and, patriotic socialism, all the things going on. And there's a bit of controversy going on right now between various people within the, there's the whole thing with Haas and infrared and everything and various other people. And I just want to say, look, we can have disagreements with each other, but at the end of the day, we should not attack each other. We should come together on those things that we agree on, because if you look at it, we agree on more than we disagree on. We agree on imperialism. We agree on supporting the anti-imperialist forces. We agree that the Democrats and the Republicans are our enemy. We have identified the synthetic left for what it is. We have so much that we agree on, very important key things that we agree on. And the things that divide us, the things that we disagree on, are secondary. They are not the primary focus. And I just want to say that, people attacking you, Dust, that agree on those things, they should stop. But also, we should not be, I don't think that you and others should be attacking Haas and Infrared. And I think that all of this on all sides, we need to stop this and realize that this is actually doing more harm than good. And we have much more in common with each other. And we don't have to personally like each other, but we have to realize that, we are the only ones who are going to be pushing for this politics. And, we're surrounded by hostile forces. We're surrounded by the synthetic left and all these people. And we need everyone we can get who identifies the problem for what it is and identifies the real solution to this. And I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, brother, so much for coming on. We're going to end it here. If everybody could raise their fist and repeat after me, good old slogan from the Panthers: dare to struggle,
Dare to
Dare to
struggle.
struggle.
dare to win,
Dare to win.
all power to the people.
All power
All
to the
power
people.
to the people.
Right on. Thank you.
Thank you, and
Good
all the
night.
best.